The dust cloud rising from the departing stagecoach was already settling when Samuel Kincaid noticed the woman standing alone beside the crooked fence post, her traveling bag at her feet and her hand shielding her eyes against the brutal New Mexico sun. He had been watering his mare at the trough outside the Abiquiu trading post when the coach had thundered past without stopping. And now, as he watched the woman's shoulders slump forward, he felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the heat. Samuel was not the kind of man who involved himself in the troubles of strangers, not anymore. At 26 years old, he had learned hard lessons about trust and kindness in a territory where both could get a man killed. He had built his cattle ranch on the outskirts of Abiquiu through sweat and determination, keeping to himself and expecting others to do the same. But something about the way this woman stood there, abandoned and clearly unprepared for the harsh reality of the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1878, made him hesitate before mounting his horse. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins during what must have been a rough journey. Her dress, though dusty now, was well made but practical, the kind a respectable woman from back east might wear when traveling to meet a husband or start a new life teaching school. The fact that the stage had left her behind suggested either a mix-up with tickets or something more deliberate, neither of which boded well for her survival out here. Samuel led his mare across the dirt street, his boots crunching on the sun-baked ground. The woman turned at his approach, and he caught sight of green eyes that held equal parts confusion and barely restrained panic. Up close, he could see the tear tracks through the dust on her cheeks, though she was clearly trying to maintain her composure. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "looks like you got yourself in a situation." Her chin lifted slightly, pride warring with desperation. "The stage was supposed to wait. I was told there would be a 15-minute stop here for the horses. I only stepped away for a moment to find water, and when I returned—" Her voice trailed off as she gestured helplessly at the empty road. "That driver's got a schedule to keep, and Pete never was one to wait for stragglers," Samuel said, studying her face. "Where were you headed?" "Santa Fe. I have a position there, teaching at a school for the children of merchants. I was supposed to arrive by tomorrow evening." She paused, then added with obvious effort, "I am Willa Ashford, Samuel Kincaid. I run cattle about 5 miles west of here." He glanced at the trading post, then back at her. "Next stage through here will not be for 3 days. You got money for a room and meals?" Willa's face paled slightly, and he had his answer before she spoke. "Most of my funds were sewn into the lining of my trunk, which continued on to Santa Fe with the stage." "Of course they were." Samuel rubbed his jaw, feeling the day's stubble rasp against his palm. Every instinct told him to walk away, to point her toward the trading post and let her figure things out on her own. Abiquiu was small, but it had enough charitable folks who might help her. But those green eyes were watching him with such desperate hope that he found himself saying, "My ranch house has a spare room. You could stay there until the next stage comes through. No charge, and my housekeeper will be there to make it proper." The relief that flooded her face was almost painful to witness. "Mr. Kincaid, I cannot possibly impose on you in such a manner. Surely there must be someone here in town who could. Mrs. Henderson, who runs the boarding house, is visiting her sister in Taos for the next 2 weeks. The trading post has rooms, but they rent by the week, not the day, and the price is not kind. You could try the saloon, but I would not recommend it for a lady." He kept his voice matter of fact, not wanting to embarrass her further. "My housekeeper is named Maria, and she has been with me for 3 years. She will be glad for the company. Like I said, No charge. Willa looked around the small settlement as if hoping another option would materialize from the desert air. Abiquiu was hardly a bustling metropolis, just a collection of adobe buildings clustered along what passed for a main street, with the remnants of an old Spanish plaza at its heart. Finally, she nodded. "You are very kind, Mr. Kincaid. I accept your generous offer, and I promise I will find a way to repay you when I reach Santa Fe and can access my funds." "No need," Samuel said, picking up her bag before she could protest. It was heavier than he expected, packed with the essentials a woman needed to start fresh in a new place. The weight of it made her situation feel more real somehow, more permanent. This was not just some traveler passing through. This was someone whose entire life had been packed into one bag, someone who had risked everything on the promise of a new beginning. He secured her bag to his saddle and helped her mount behind him, acutely aware of her hands gripping his waist as they rode out of town. The contact felt strange after so long keeping people at arm's length. His mare handled the double load without complaint, settling into an easy pace on the well-worn trail to his ranch. "Have you been in New Mexico long?" Willa asked after they had ridden in silence for several minutes. "About 5 years. Came out from Kansas after the war." "The war? But you would have been just a boy. Old enough to fight in the last year of it. Old enough to know I did not want to go back to what was left of my family's farm afterward." He kept his eyes on the horizon, not wanting to see whatever expression crossed her face. Most people had war stories, and most were better left unshared. "I am from Massachusetts," Willa offered. "My father was a professor of literature at a small college. He died last year and my mother passed when I was 16. I have been living with my aunt since my father died, but she made it clear that I could not stay indefinitely without contributing to the household expenses. Teaching seemed like a respectable option, and when I saw the advertisement for a position in Santa Fe, it felt like Providence." Samuel heard what she did not say in the careful spaces between her words. She had been unwanted, a burden, pushed toward whatever opportunity would take her far away. It was a story he understood better than she might guess. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, and Samuel felt the usual mixture of pride and exhaustion he always experienced when seeing his land. The house was small but sturdy, built of adobe in the Spanish style with a covered porch that provided shade during the brutal summer months. The barn and corrals were well maintained, and beyond them stretched the grassland where his cattle grazed, maybe 150 head at last count. It was not much compared to some of the bigger operations, but it was his, built with his own hands and his own sweat. Maria appeared in the doorway as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a stout woman in her 50s with gray streaking through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Samuel Kincaid, you did not tell me you would bring a guest," she called out in Spanish accented English. "Did not know it myself until an hour ago," Samuel replied, dismounting and then helping Willa down. "This is Miss Ashford. The stage left her behind in town, and she needs a place to stay until the next one comes through. I told her you would not mind the company." Maria's sharp eyes swept over Willa, taking in the travel-worn dress and the proud set of her shoulders despite obvious exhaustion. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she smiled warmly and gestured toward the house. Of course. Come inside, miss. You must be tired and hungry. Samuel, bring her bag to the spare room, then go tend to your horse. I will take care of our guest." Samuel did as he was told, grateful for Maria's efficiency. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in one of Maria's woven blankets and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. He set Willa's bag on the bed and retreated quickly. suddenly aware of how intimate it felt to be in a bedroom with a woman he had just met. He spent the next hour tending to his mare and checking on the cattle in the near pasture, trying not to think about the stranger now under his roof. He had meant what he said about it being proper with Maria there, but he could not shake the memory of Willa's hands on his waist during the ride, or the way her green eyes had looked at him like he was some kind of hero instead of just a man who could not walk away from someone in trouble. When he finally returned to the house, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that never failed to take his breath away. He found Willa sitting on the porch with Maria, a cup of coffee in her hands and some color returned to her cheeks. She had washed the dust from her face and repinned her hair, and in the golden light of the fading day, she was striking enough to make his steps falter. "Maria has been telling me about Abiquiu," Willa said as he joined them on the porch. "I had no idea the settlement was so old. She says some of the buildings date back to the 1700s when this was still Spanish territory." Samuel accepted the coffee Maria poured for him and settled into one of the wooden chairs he had built during his first winter here. Not much to look at now, but it has history. The plaza was a stop on the Spanish trade routes, and there's been farming here for centuries. The Rio Chama runs not far from here, which is the only reason anything grows in this country. They talked as the sun set, the conversation flowing more easily than Samuel would have expected. Willa asked about the ranch and the challenges of raising cattle in the desert, and he found himself explaining things he rarely discussed with anyone. She was genuinely interested, asking intelligent questions that showed she was paying attention, not just making polite conversation. Maria served dinner inside as the evening cooled, a hearty stew with fresh bread that Willa praised sincerely. Samuel noticed she ate with good appetite despite the upheaval of her day, which spoke to a practical nature that would serve her well in the territory. Too many people came west with romantic notions that died quickly under the harsh realities of the land. "What made you choose teaching?" Samuel asked as Maria cleared the plates. Willa's expression grew thoughtful. "I love books and learning like my father did. But more than that, I wanted to do something meaningful with my life. My aunt believed a woman's only purpose was to marry well and manage a household, but I wanted more than that. I wanted to make a difference, even if just in the lives of a few children. Teaching gives me that opportunity." "Noble reasons," Samuel said, and meant it. "But you know Santa Fe is not Boston or New York. The children you teach will be the sons and daughters of merchants and ranchers, maybe some military families from the fort. They will need practical education more than classical literature." "I understand that. The position requires teaching reading, writing, mathematics, and some history. I am prepared to teach what is needed." She met his eyes directly. "I did not come here expecting elegance or refinement, Mr. Kincaid. I came here expecting work and a chance to prove myself. The West may not be what I am used to, but I am not as fragile as you might think." There was steel beneath that educated Eastern accent, and Samuel found himself reassessing her yet again. "I did not mean to imply you were fragile. Just that a lot of people come out here with certain expectations, and the reality tends to disappoint them." "What about you?" Willa asked, turning the question back on him. "Have you found what you expected?" Samuel considered that as he stared into his coffee. "I expected hard work and solitude. That is what I got. The disappointment comes from other things, things that do not have much to do with the land itself." He did not elaborate, and Willa was perceptive enough not to push. Maria, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, announced that she would be heading home for the night. She lived in a small house on the property that had once been a storage building, converted by Samuel when he hired her. "I will return in the morning to make breakfast," Maria said, giving Samuel a pointed look that suggested they would be having a conversation later about his unexpected house guest. "Miss Ashford, if you need anything during the night, Samuel's room is just down the hall, though I trust you will not need to disturb him." After Maria left, an awkward silence settled over the house. Willa stood and began gathering the remaining dishes from the table. "Let me wash these." "It is the least I can do." "You do not have to do that. You are a guest. A guest who is imposing on your hospitality with no way to repay you yet. Please let me help." She was already carrying dishes to the kitchen basin, and Samuel did not have the heart to argue. He found himself drying dishes as she washed them, the domestic routine feeling strange but not unpleasant. They worked in comfortable silence, and Samuel was struck by how natural it felt to have her moving around his kitchen, as if she had always been there. "Can I ask you something?" Willa said as she handed him a dripping plate. "Go ahead." "Why did you help me today? You do not know me, and as you said yourself, you have learned not to trust strangers. So why?" Samuel dried the plate slowly, considering his answer. "I saw someone in trouble who did not deserve to be in that situation. I saw someone trying to make something of themselves who got dealt a bad hand through no fault of their own. And I guess I saw someone who reminded me a little of myself when I first came here with nothing but determination and a stubborn refusal to quit." Willa turned to look at him fully, soap suds dripping from her hands. "Thank you for seeing that. And for not just seeing a helpless woman to be pitied. Is that how your aunt saw you?" "My aunt saw me as a burden to be managed and eventually disposed of. My father saw me as his intellectual equal, someone capable of great things. After he died, I tried very hard to prove to my aunt that he was right, but she had already made up her mind about what I was worth." Willa's voice was steady, but Samuel heard the hurt beneath the words. "Then your aunt was a fool," he said simply. "And you are better off out here making your own way." She smiled at that, and it transformed her face completely, erasing the worry lines and revealing the genuine beauty beneath the travel weariness. "I hope you are right, Mr. Kincaid. Call me Samuel. If you are staying under my roof, even for just a few days, we can skip the formalities. Then you must call me Willa." They finished the dishes together, and Samuel showed her where the lamps were kept and how to bank the fire in the stove for the night. When he finally bid her good night and retreated to his own room, he found himself staring at the ceiling for a long time, unable to sleep. His house had never felt so full, even though Maria had stayed over plenty of times during bad weather. This was different. This was a woman who stirred something in him that he had thought dead and buried along with all the other dreams he had given up on. Samuel rose before dawn, as was his habit, dressing quietly and stepping out into the cool pre-morning air. The ranch needed tending regardless of whatever else was happening in his life, and the routine of morning chores helped settle his mind. He fed and watered the horses, checked the fences in the near pastures, and was heading back to the house when he saw Willa standing on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill and watching the sun rise over the mountains. "You are up early," he said as he joined her. "I could not sleep much. I kept thinking about everything that happened yesterday and everything that still needs to happen. 3 days feels like an eternity when your entire future is hanging in the balance." She glanced at him. "Do you think the school in Santa Fe will hold the position for me if I arrive late? If they are desperate enough for teachers, they will. If they are not, then maybe it was not meant to be." "That is not very reassuring." "I have learned that things work out the way they are supposed to, even if it is not always the way we planned." He leaned against the porch rail, studying her profile in the growing light. "You have a backup plan?" "Not really. I spent everything I had on the journey here, and the necessary supplies for setting up in a new place. If the position in Santa Fe falls through, I suppose I will have to find work wherever I can and save enough for passage back east. Though the thought of returning to my aunt's house makes me want to do just about anything to avoid it. Maria arrived then, bustling up the path from her house with her arms full of eggs from the chicken coop she maintained. "Good morning. I see everyone is up bright and early. Samuel, you have been working already. Willa, you should have slept longer. You still look tired from your journey." Breakfast was a cheerful affair with Maria chattering about the gossip from town and the various happenings on the nearby ranches. Samuel listened with half an ear, more focused on the way Willa seemed to relax in Maria's presence, the tension in her shoulders easing as she laughed at the housekeeper's stories. After breakfast, Samuel needed to ride out to the far pastures to check on a pregnant cow that had been showing signs of distress. He hesitated before asking, "Would you like to come along? It will give you a chance to see more of the ranch, and the ride might do you good after being cooped up in that stage for however many days." Willa's face lit up. "I would love that if you are sure I will not be in the way. You will be fine. Can you ride?" "I learned as a girl, though it has been some time." Samuel saddled a gentle gelding for her and his mare for himself, taking his time to make sure the stirrups were adjusted properly for Willa's shorter legs. She mounted with only a little awkwardness, settling into the saddle with growing confidence as the horse stood patiently beneath her. They rode out at an easy pace, Samuel pointing out landmarks and boundaries as they went. The morning was perfect, cool enough to be comfortable with the promise of heat later in the day. The high desert landscape stretched around them in subtle shades of tan and green, broken by dark clusters of juniper and piñon trees. In the distance, the Gemmas Mountains rose against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. "It is beautiful here," Willa said, her voice filled with wonder. "I expected everything to be brown and dead, but there is so much life if you know where to look. The desert surprises people that way. It is harsh and unforgiving, but it has its own kind of beauty." Samuel found himself seeing the land through her eyes, remembering the awe he had felt when he first arrived. Years of hard work had dulled that initial wonder, but having Willa here brought it back. They found the pregnant cow in a sheltered arroyo, and Samuel was relieved to see she appeared to be doing better than the day before. He checked her over carefully while Willa watched from a respectful distance, her interest clearly genuine rather than polite. "How much longer until she gives birth?" Willa asked. "A week, maybe less. First-time mothers can be unpredictable. I will need to check on her daily until the calf comes." He straightened up, patting the cow's flank. "Ranching is a lot of waiting and watching, not as exciting as people think." "I think it is plenty exciting. You are responsible for the lives of all these animals, and you have built something real and lasting with your own hands. That seems far more meaningful than most work." They rode back slowly, and Samuel found himself telling her things he rarely shared with anyone. About the early days when he nearly starved because he did not know enough about raising cattle in this climate. About the first winter when he lost half his herd to a blizzard and almost gave up. About the slow, grinding work of building something from nothing, and the satisfaction that came with finally seeing it succeed. Willa listened intently, asking questions that showed she understood the significance of what he was saying. By the time they returned to the ranch house for lunch, Samuel felt like he had known her far longer than a single day. The afternoon passed in a comfortable routine. Samuel worked on mending tack in the barn while Willa helped Maria with the garden and the chickens. When evening came and they gathered for dinner, it felt natural having her at his table, as if she had always been part of his life. That night, they sat on the porch again as the sun set. Samuel had brought out a bottle of whiskey and poured them each a small glass, and they sipped it slowly while watching the sky turn from gold to purple to black. 2 more days, Willa said quietly. Then I will be on my way to Santa Fe and you can return to your normal life. My normal life is not going anywhere. And honestly, this has been a nice change. I forget sometimes what it is like to have real conversation with someone besides Maria and the occasional ranch hand I hire for roundup. You must get lonely out here. Samuel considered that. Lonely implies wanting something different. I chose this solitude. After everything that happened during the war and then trying to make it work back in Kansas, I wanted to be somewhere I did not have to depend on anyone or have anyone depend on me. Out here, the only person who can disappoint me is myself. That sounds like a very safe way to live, also very sad. He looked at her sharply, but there was no judgment in her face, only understanding. Maybe it is both. For what it is worth, I think you are wrong about one thing. Maria depends on you and you on her. You have built something here together, even if you do not want to acknowledge it. That is not weakness, Samuel. That is just being human. Her words settled over him like a weight, uncomfortable but not entirely unwelcome. He had spent so long convincing himself that isolation was strength, that he had forgotten what it felt like to let someone see past his defenses. The second day of Willa's stay followed a similar pattern, but with growing ease between them. Samuel found reasons to include her in his daily routine, showing her how to check the water levels in the stock tanks and pointing out the different plants that grew wild on his land. She was an eager student, genuinely interested in learning about this new environment she found herself in. That evening, as they were finishing dinner, a rider appeared on the trail leading to the ranch. Samuel tensed automatically, his hand moving toward the rifle he kept by the door. Visitors were rare, and unexpected visitors were often trouble. But as the rider came closer, Samuel recognized Pete Holloway, the stage driver who had left Willa behind in Abiquiu. Pete dismounted slowly, his weathered face apologetic as Samuel stepped out onto the porch. "Samuel," Pete said, nodding a greeting. "I heard in town that you took in the lady I accidentally left behind. I wanted to come by and apologize to her directly, and to bring this." He held up a worn leather valise. "Found it wedged under one of the seats when I was cleaning out the coach in Santa Fe. Figured it might belong to her." Willa had appeared in the doorway, and her face lit up when she saw the valise. "That is mine. It had my papers and some personal items I thought were lost forever." Pete handed it over with obvious relief. "I am real sorry about leaving you behind, miss. I did not realize you had stepped away, and by the time I found out, we were already halfway to the next stop. I would have come back, but I was running behind schedule as it was." "I understand," Willa said graciously. "These things happen. Thank you for bringing this to me." After Pete left, declining Samuel's offer of coffee with the excuse that he needed to get back to town before full dark, Willa opened the valise carefully. Inside were documents confirming her teaching position, several letters from her father that she clearly treasured, and a small packet wrapped in cloth. "What is that?" Samuel asked, curious despite himself. Willa unwrapped the cloth to reveal an old book, its leather cover worn soft with age. "This was my father's favorite volume of poetry. He read from it every night before bed when I was a child. I could not bear to leave it behind when I packed to come west." She opened the book carefully, and Samuel caught sight of handwritten notes in the margins, a conversation between father and daughter preserved in fading ink. The intimacy of it made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. "Would you read something from it?" he asked impulsively. Willa looked surprised but pleased. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, then began to read in a clear, steady voice. The poem was about journeys and destinations, about leaving home to find yourself in strange lands. Samuel listened, not really understanding all the fancy language but moved by the sound of her voice and the obvious love she had for these words. When she finished, they sat in silence for a moment. Then Samuel said, "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I have ever known. He taught me to think for myself, to question everything, to never settle for less than I was capable of achieving. My aunt thought he filled my head with nonsense, that he was preparing me for a life I could never have as a woman. But he believed in me, truly believed I could do anything I set my mind to." Her voice caught slightly. "I miss him every day. He would be proud of you, coming all this way to make something of yourself. I hope so. Some days I am not sure if I am being brave or just foolish." Bravery and foolishness often look the same from the outside. The difference is in whether it works out in the end. Willa laughed at that, and the melancholy moment passed. But later, as Samuel lay in bed trying to sleep, he found himself thinking about fathers and daughters, about belief and trust, about the people who shaped us and the holes they left behind when they were gone. The third day dawned with a heaviness that Samuel did not want to acknowledge. Tomorrow the stage would come through Abiquiu, and Willa would board it and continue on to Santa Fe and the life waiting for her there. He told himself it was for the best, that her presence had been a pleasant distraction but nothing more. He told himself he would be relieved to return to his normal routine. He was lying, and he knew it. Maria knew it too, based on the knowing looks she kept giving him throughout the morning. Finally, while Willa was occupied with washing some clothes in preparation for her departure, Maria cornered him in the barn. "You are going to let her leave," Maria said. "It was not a question. She has a job waiting in Santa Fe, a life she planned. I cannot ask her to give that up." "Cannot or will not." Samuel set down the bridle he had been cleaning and met Maria's eyes directly. "What would you have me do? She has been here 3 days. I barely know her. You expect me to ask her to stay based on what exactly?" "Based on the way you look at her when you think no one is watching. Based on the way she looks at you the same way. Based on the fact that you have been less alone in these 3 days than in the 3 years I have known you." Maria's expression softened. "Samuel, I know you have been hurt. I know you came here to escape pain and disappointment, but running away from connection is not the same as healing from it. You are assuming she feels anything for me beyond gratitude for helping her when she needed it. Am I? Or are you assuming she could not possibly want a life here because you have convinced yourself you are not worth staying for?" The words hit harder than Maria probably intended, cutting through the defenses Samuel had spent years building. Before he could respond, they heard Willa calling from the house, asking if anyone wanted fresh coffee. Samuel spent the afternoon riding out to check on his cattle, needing space to think. Maria's words echoed in his head, mixing with the memory of Willa's laugh, the feel of her hands on his waist during that first ride, the way she looked at sunrise with wonder in her eyes. He had told himself he wanted solitude, but these past 3 days had shown him the difference between chosen isolation and loneliness. Willa's presence had not felt like an intrusion. It had felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding something he had not known he was missing. But what could he offer her? A hard life on a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere, long days of work and few luxuries. She was educated, refined, destined for better things than mucking out stalls and hauling water from the well. How could he ask her to give up teaching, the dream she had risked everything to pursue, for a life with a man she barely knew? Samuel returned to the ranch as the sun was setting on Willa's last night under his roof. He found her on the porch, that same shawl wrapped around her shoulders, staring out at the mountains with an expression he could not quite read. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I was thinking about how much has changed in just 3 days. When that stage left me behind, I felt like my entire world was ending, like I had failed before I even got started. But now—" She trailed off, then looked at him directly. "Now I find myself wishing I had more time before moving on to whatever comes next." Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. "Willa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right? What do you want? Not what you planned, not what you think you should want. What do you actually want from your life?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting in the fringe of her shawl. "I want to matter to someone. I want to build something meaningful with my own hands. I want to wake up each morning knowing that the day ahead holds purpose and connection, not just obligation. I want to be seen as myself, not as a burden or a problem to be solved." She met his eyes. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I have spent the last 3 days trying to convince myself that you leaving is the right thing, the smart thing. That you have your life planned out and I have mine, and the two do not intersect beyond these few days. But the truth is, Willa, I do not want you to leave. I know that is selfish, and I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But the thought of you boarding that stage tomorrow makes me feel like I am about to lose something precious before I even had a chance to really know it." Willa's eyes had gone wide, her breath catching audibly. "Samuel, you do not have to say anything. I just needed you to know that these 3 days have meant more to me than I can properly put into words. That you have made me remember what it feels like to want something beyond just surviving day to day. That watching you see beauty in this harsh land has made me fall in love with it all over again." He paused, then pushed forward. "That I have fallen in love with you, somewhere between pulling you onto my horse in Abiquiu and sitting here on this porch watching you look at the sunset, like it is the most magnificent thing you have ever seen." The words hung in the air between them, enormous and irreversible. Samuel waited, his heart pounding so hard he thought she must be able to hear it. "I do not want to leave," Willa whispered finally. "I told myself I did, that I had to follow through with my plans, that staying here would be reckless and impulsive. But the truth is, Samuel, these 3 days have shown me what my life could be if I had the courage to reach for it. You have shown me a kind of life I never imagined wanting, and now I cannot imagine anything else. What about teaching? Your position in Santa Fe. Teaching was a means to an end. It was a way to have purpose and independence, to matter in some small way. But there are children in Abiquiu who need education too, and ranches throughout this territory where I could offer lessons. Or maybe I do not teach at all. Maybe I learn ranching instead, or help Maria with her chickens, or find some entirely different purpose. The specifics matter less than the fact that I would be choosing my own path, building a life with someone who sees me for who I actually am." Samuel reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Are you sure? Because once you step off this porch as something other than my guest, there is no going back. People will talk and assumptions will be made. Your reputation in this territory will be tied to mine, for better or worse." "Then we should do this properly," Willa said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Samuel Kincaid, are you asking me to marry you?" The directness of the question should have terrified him, but instead, Samuel felt something like relief flood through his chest. "I suppose I am. I know it is sudden, and I know we should probably court properly for a few months and do this the right way. But I have learned that life out here does not always allow for proper timing. Sometimes you have to grab hold of happiness when it appears and trust that the rest will work itself out." Yes, Willa said simply. My answer is yes. Samuel kissed her then, there on the porch in the fading light, and it felt like sealing a promise that had been building since the moment he first saw her standing alone beside that fence post. Her lips were soft against his, and when she sighed into the kiss, he felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. They sat together long after the sun had set, making plans and dreaming out loud about the future they would build together. Samuel would send word to Santa Fe about Willa's situation, ensuring the school found another teacher and that her trunk was sent back to Abiquiu. They would marry quickly and quietly, not wanting to wait or make a fuss. Maria would be delighted. Of that Samuel was certain. When they finally went inside, Samuel walked Willa to the door of the spare room, reluctant to leave her even for the few hours until morning. I will see you at breakfast, he said, lifting her hand to his lips. I cannot believe this is real, Willa murmured. Yesterday I was terrified that my entire future was falling apart, and now I feel like it is finally falling into place. That is the thing about the future. It has a way of surprising us. The next morning, Samuel rode into Abiquiu with Willa beside him, but instead of waiting for the stage, they went directly to the small Catholic church where Father Miguel served the local community. The priest was surprised but willing to marry them after hearing their story, though he insisted on at least a brief conversation about the sacrament of marriage and the commitment they were making. This is not a decision to be made lightly, Father Miguel said, his weathered face serious as he looked between them. Marriage is a covenant before God, meant to last until death parts you. You say you have known each other only 3 days. 3 days can be enough when you pay attention, Samuel said. I know what I want, Father, and I know that if I let Willa leave here today without speaking up, I will regret it for the rest of my life. And you, Miss Ashford, you are willing to give up your plans, your teaching position, to marry a man you just met. Willa's answer was steady and sure. My plans were built on necessity, not desire. This choice is built on something far more solid. Yes, Father, I am certain. Father Miguel studied them for another long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I will marry you, but I will hold you both to your vows. This territory is hard enough without broken promises adding to the difficulty. They were married in the small chapel with Maria and the priest's housekeeper as witnesses. Samuel had purchased a simple gold band from the trading post, and it slid onto Willa's finger like it had been made for her. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed his bride with a mixture of tenderness and fierce joy that made Maria dab at her eyes with her apron. The stage rumbled into Abiquiu an hour later, but Willa did not board it. Instead, she stood beside her husband and watched it depart, heading toward a future that was no longer hers. She felt no regret, only relief and anticipation for the life stretching out before her. They celebrated that evening with a dinner Maria prepared with obvious delight, having raided her personal stores for treats she had been saving. There was roasted chicken and potatoes, fresh bread with honey, and even a small cake she had somehow managed to throw together in the hours while Samuel and Willa were in town. To new beginnings, Maria toasted, raising her glass of wine. And to love that is brave enough to recognize itself when it appears. That night, Samuel carried Willa over the threshold of his ranch house, no longer a guest room but their shared home. He was gentle with her, understanding that despite their quick marriage, there was still much they needed to learn about each other. They talked long into the night, sharing stories and dreams, building the foundation of intimacy that would sustain them through whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a revelation for both of them. Samuel discovered that Willa was not delicate or helpless, but possessed a core of strength that adapted quickly to the demands of ranch life. She learned to tend the chickens without fear, to help with the vegetable garden Maria maintained, and even to ride out with Samuel to check on the cattle. Her hands blistered and her face tanned, but she never complained, finding joy in the physical work and the simple satisfaction of a job well done. Willa discovered depths to Samuel that his taciturn exterior had hidden. He was thoughtful and surprisingly tender, leaving wildflowers on her pillow when he came in from early morning chores, or reading aloud to her in the evenings from the few books he owned. He had a quiet sense of humor that emerged once he felt safe expressing it, and a capacity for patience that served him well, as he taught her the skills she needed to be a true partner in running the ranch. Maria watched them with obvious satisfaction, pleased to see the lonely man she had worked for finally opening up to the possibility of happiness. She gave them space when they needed it, but offered guidance when asked, becoming as much a friend as an employee to both of them. 2 months after their wedding, Willa made her first trip into Abiquiu as Samuel's wife. The townspeople were curious but generally welcoming, having heard the story of the stage leaving her behind and Samuel's gallant rescue. Mrs. Henderson, back from visiting her sister, was particularly interested in meeting the new Mrs. Kincaid, inviting her to the weekly ladies' sewing circle that met at the boarding house. Willa accepted, sensing an opportunity to build connections in the community. The women who gathered that first afternoon were a mixed group, ranging from the elderly Senora Martinez, who had lived in Abiquiu since before it became American territory, to young Mary Thompson, whose husband worked as a blacksmith in town. They were welcoming but watchful, waiting to see what kind of woman had captured the heart of the notoriously private Samuel Kincaid. Willa won them over by being herself, sharing honestly about her journey west and her unexpected change of plans, asking genuine questions about their lives and listening intently to the answers. By the time she returned to the ranch that evening, she had been invited to help organize a school for the local children, teaching them twice a week in a room above the trading post. "They asked me to teach," Willa told Samuel excitedly over dinner. "Not formally, like I would have in Santa Fe, but something even better. The children here need education, and many of the parents cannot afford to send them away to school. If I can teach them reading and mathematics and writing, even just a few hours each week, I will be making a real difference." Samuel smiled at her enthusiasm, loving the way her eyes lit up when she talked about something she was passionate about. "You should do it, but only if you want to, not because you think you have to prove something." "I want to, not to prove anything, but because it matters. Because those children deserve a chance to learn, and I have the skills to help them." She reached across the table to take his hand. "Thank you for supporting this. Thank you for choosing a life where you could do this work, for choosing me and this place and this future." As autumn gave way to winter, their life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The cattle were prepared for the cold months ahead, with hay stored in the barn and the stock ponds checked regularly to ensure they would not freeze solid. Samuel hired 2 ranch hands for the winter, young men from town who needed work and were willing to learn. They built a small bunkhouse for the hands, giving them a place to stay that provided both privacy and proximity to the main house. Willa's teaching took on a regular schedule, with 8 children of varying ages attending classes on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She loved the work, finding satisfaction in watching her students slowly master reading and arithmetic. Several of the older students showed real promise, and Willa began keeping notes on their progress, thinking ahead to how she might help them continue their education. Christmas came, and with it, Willa's first experience of the holiday in New Mexico. Maria taught her to make bizcochitos and tamales, traditional foods that filled the house with wonderful smells. Samuel cut a small piñon tree and brought it inside, and Willa decorated it with ornaments made from scraps of fabric and tin. They attended Christmas Mass at the chapel in town, and Willa felt a deep sense of belonging as she knelt beside her husband in the candlelit church. On Christmas night, after they had returned home and were sitting by the fire, Willa told Samuel about the gift she could not wrap. "I think I am pregnant." Samuel's expression went through several rapid changes, shock giving way to wonder, giving way to fierce joy. "You think, or you know?" "I am reasonably certain. The signs are there, and I am now 2 weeks late for my monthly courses, which is not typical for me." She searched his face anxiously. "Are you happy about this?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Samuel said, pulling her into his arms. "Terrified, yes, but happier than I have been since the day you said yes to marrying me. A child, Willa, we are going to have a child." They held each other in front of the fire, talking about names and nurseries and all the ways their life would change. Maria cried when they told her the next morning, insisting that she would help care for the baby and teach it Spanish from birth. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Willa continued teaching until she was 6 months along, then reluctantly handed over her classes to Mary Thompson, who had discovered a talent for education herself. The students presented Willa with a quilt they had worked on together, each child contributing a square decorated with something meaningful to them. Willa cried when they gave it to her, overwhelmed by the love and care stitched into every piece. Samuel was attentive to the point of hovering, constantly worried about Willa doing too much or straining herself. She tolerated his concern with good humor, knowing it came from love rather than any belief that she was fragile. As her belly swelled and the baby began to kick, Samuel would place his hand on her stomach and feel their child moving, his face filled with awe. "I never thought I would have this," he admitted one evening as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her rounded belly. "A wife I love, a child on the way, a home that feels full instead of empty. I spent so long protecting myself from disappointment that I almost missed the chance for all of this." "But you did not miss it," Willa said, covering his hand with hers. "You were brave enough to reach for it when the moment came. We both were." In late July, as the summer heat reached its peak, Willa went into labor. Samuel sent one of the ranch hands racing to town for the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen who had delivered half the babies in the territory. Maria boiled water and prepared clean linens, her face calm despite Samuel's obvious panic. "You need to breathe and stay out of the way," Maria told him firmly. "This is women's work. Go tend to something outside until we call for you." Samuel paced the porch instead, unable to go far from the house where Willa labored. He had faced down stampeding cattle and dangerous storms without flinching, but the sounds of his wife in pain nearly brought him to his knees. When the baby's first cry finally pierced the air, Samuel thought his heart might burst from the force of his relief. Maria appeared on the porch, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Samuel, a healthy, strong boy, and Willa is asking for you." Samuel entered the bedroom to find his wife propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Maria's soft blankets. Willa looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Come meet your son." Samuel approached slowly, almost reverently, afraid he might break something with his rough rancher's hands. But when Willa placed the baby in his arms, everything else fell away. His son was perfect, with a downy covering of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn the same green as his mother's. The baby's tiny hand curled around Samuel's finger, and the grip felt like an anchor, tying him to this moment and this life with unbreakable strength. "What should we name him?" Willa asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son's face, Samuel knew exactly what felt right. "Daniel, after my father. He died before I could make peace with him, but I like to think he would be proud of this, of us, of the life we have built here." "Daniel Kincaid," Willa said softly, trying the name out. "It is perfect." The weeks after Daniel's birth were exhausting but joyful. Samuel discovered a capacity for tenderness he had not known he possessed, cradling his tiny son and singing off-key lullabies when the baby fussed at night. Willa recovered her strength slowly, aided by Maria's cooking and Samuel's insistence that she rest as much as possible. The community rallied around them, bringing gifts of food and baby clothes, offering advice and congratulations. Willa's students came to visit, peering at the baby with fascination and asking when Mrs. Kincaid would return to teaching. Willa promised she would be back when Daniel was a bit older, but for now, she was content to focus on her son and her husband and the life they were building together. As autumn arrived again, marking more than a year since Willa had been left behind in Abiquiu, Samuel stood on his porch at sunset with his wife beside him and his son sleeping in her arms. The ranch stretched out before them, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the mountains standing watch over it all. "You ever regret it?" Samuel asked quietly. "Giving up teaching in Santa Fe, the life you planned?" Willa leaned against him, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "Not even for a moment. That life was built on running away from something. This life is built on running towards something. There is all the difference in the world between the two." "I love you," Samuel said, the words coming easier now after more than a year of practice. "I love you and our son and the life we have made. Thank you for being brave enough to stay. Thank you for being brave enough to ask me to." They stood together as the sun set and the stars began to appear, a family complete and whole, bound together by choice and courage and love that had recognized itself in the briefest of moments and held on tight enough to become permanent. 2 years passed in the steady rhythm of ranch life. Daniel grew into a sturdy toddler who loved following his father around the ranch, his chubby legs working hard to keep up with Samuel's long strides. Willa returned to teaching part-time, bringing Daniel with her to the schoolroom where he played quietly while his mother instructed the older children. The school had grown, with 12 students now attending regularly, and Willa had begun corresponding with educational institutions back east about obtaining proper textbooks and supplies. Samuel's ranch continued to prosper. He had expanded his herd carefully, adding quality breeding stock that improved the overall health and hardiness of his cattle. The 2 ranch hands he had hired became permanent employees, proving themselves reliable and skilled. With their help, Samuel was able to take on more cattle and improve the infrastructure of the ranch, building better corrals and a larger barn. On a cool evening in November, as they celebrated Daniel's 2nd birthday with a small cake Maria had made, Willa told Samuel they would be adding to their family again. This time, Samuel's reaction was pure joy, unmarred by the fear that had accompanied the first pregnancy. He knew now what to expect, and more importantly, he had absolute faith in Willa's strength and resilience. Their daughter was born the following June, arriving on a morning when the wildflowers were blooming across the high desert in an unusual profusion of color. They named her Caroline, after Willa's mother, and she was a serene baby who rarely fussed, seeming content to observe the world with wide eyes that turned the same amber brown as her father's. With 2 small children, life became more chaotic but no less happy. Daniel doted on his baby sister, bringing her flowers and rocks he found interesting, singing to her the way he had heard his parents do. Willa juggled teaching with motherhood, sometimes conducting classes with Caroline strapped to her back in a cradle board Maria had acquired from one of the local Pueblo women. Samuel watched his wife handle it all with a mixture of awe and love. She had transformed from the frightened woman left behind by the stage into someone strong and capable, deeply rooted in the community and confident in her place within it. She had become fluent in Spanish, learning from Maria and the families of her students, and could hold her own in conversations about ranching, weather, and local politics. 3 years after Caroline's birth, Willa surprised Samuel by suggesting they expand their home. "We have been blessed with so much," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, their familiar perch for important conversations. "Our children are healthy, the ranch is doing well, and I cannot help but think we have room in our hearts and home for more. There are children in this territory who need families, orphans from disease or accident or abandonment. What would you think about taking in a child who needs a home?" Samuel considered this, turning the idea over in his mind. They had built something good here, something stable and loving. Sharing that with a child who had nothing seemed not just generous but right. "I think that sounds exactly like something we should do." They made inquiries through Father Miguel and the various communities connected to Abiquiu. Within 2 months, they were introduced to a boy named Thomas, age 7, whose parents had died of fever the previous winter. He had been staying with distant relatives who could not afford another mouth to feed, and the fear and sadness in his eyes when they first met him broke Willa's heart. Thomas came to live with them on a trial basis, uncertain and withdrawn, clearly expecting to be disappointed or rejected. Samuel and Willa gave him time and space, making sure he knew he was welcome but not forcing affection or connection. Slowly, Thomas began to relax, coaxed out of his shell by Daniel's exuberant friendliness and Caroline's sweet nature. By the time the trial period ended, Thomas was calling them mother and father without prompting, and the adoption was made permanent. The years rolled on, each bringing its own challenges and triumphs. Drought tested them one summer, forcing Samuel to sell off part of the herd to conserve resources, but they weathered it together and rebuilt stronger than before. A bad winter brought blizzards that isolated them for weeks, but they had prepared well and emerged unscathed. Through it all, their love deepened and matured, growing from that initial spark of recognition into something solid and enduring. Daniel grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and wanted nothing more than to follow in his father's footsteps. Samuel taught him everything about cattle and horses, about reading the land and the weather, about the hard work and dedication required to make a life in this unforgiving territory. Thomas discovered a talent for carpentry, helping Samuel with building projects and showing real skill in crafting furniture and tools. Caroline was bright and curious, inheriting her mother's love of learning and spending hours listening to Willa read from their growing collection of books. When Daniel was 10, Caroline 8, and Thomas 15, Willa discovered she was pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, and at 35, Willa felt every year. But she was determined, and when their second son arrived healthy and screaming in the spring of 1889, both parents felt the familiar rush of overwhelming love. They named this son William, and he proved to be as adventurous as his older brother was serious. He walked early, talked early, and seemed determined to explore everything his small hands could reach. Samuel joked that William was getting them back for how easy Caroline had been as a baby. The ranch continued to grow, becoming one of the most respected operations in the territory. Samuel's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread, and he found himself consulted by newer ranchers looking for advice. He was generous with his knowledge, remembering his own early struggles and wanting to help others avoid the same mistakes. Willa's school became an established institution in Abiquiu, with the territorial government finally providing some funding for supplies and materials. She trained other teachers, helping to establish schools in neighboring communities, and corresponded regularly with educators throughout the Southwest. Her students went on to become teachers themselves, shopkeepers, ranchers, and respected members of their communities, carrying with them the love of learning she had instilled. Thomas stayed on the ranch after reaching adulthood, becoming Samuel's right-hand man, and eventually taking over much of the day-to-day management of the cattle operation. He married a young woman from town named Elizabeth, and they built a house on the southern edge of the ranch property, starting their own family while remaining part of the larger Kincaid operation. Daniel showed no interest in leaving, instead learning everything he could about ranching and preparing to eventually take over from his father. He was 22 when he married Sarah, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and brought her to live in a new house Samuel and Thomas built specifically for the young couple. Caroline, bright and determined, surprised everyone by deciding she wanted to study medicine. With Willa and Samuel's full support, she went east to attend a women's medical college, one of the few institutions that would accept female students. She returned to New Mexico 4 years later as Dr. Caroline Kincaid, setting up a practice that served the scattered communities throughout the region. She never married, finding her calling in healing rather than family life, though she remained close to her parents and siblings. William, true to his adventurous nature, spent several years exploring the territories before settling down. He worked for the railroad, for mining companies, even tried his hand at prospecting before finally returning to Abiquiu with a wife from Colorado and a newfound appreciation for the ranch where he had grown up. He and his wife, Margaret, took over the old bunkhouse that had been expanded and improved over the years, and William became invaluable in managing the business aspects of the ranch. As Samuel and Willa entered their 50s, they found themselves surrounded by children and grandchildren, presiding over a family that had grown far beyond what either of them could have imagined that day when he first spotted her left behind in Abiquiu. The ranch house had been expanded multiple times, with rooms added to accommodate visiting children and grandchildren, but Samuel and Willa still spent their evenings on that same porch where they had first confessed their love. "You remember what you said to me that third night?" Willa asked one evening as they watched the sunset, their hands intertwined the way they had been for more than 30 years. "When you told me you had fallen in love with me." "I remember every word," Samuel said. "I was terrified you would laugh at me or think I was insane for falling so fast. I was terrified you would never say anything, and I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to stay." Willa leaned her head against his shoulder. "We have built a beautiful life together." "We have," Samuel agreed. "And it all started because I could not walk away from a woman who needed help, and you were willing to trust a stranger with your future." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Around them, the sounds of family drifted from the house where Maria, now in her 80s but still spry, was teaching the youngest grandchildren to make tortillas. Daniel's voice mingled with Thomas's as they discussed plans for the spring roundup. Caroline's laugh rang out as she played with her nieces and nephews who adored their Dr. Aunt. "I have been thinking," Willa said eventually, "about everything we have built here and what will happen when we are gone." Morbid thoughts for such a beautiful evening. Not morbid, just practical. We should make sure everything is properly arranged. The ranch divided fairly between the children, the school endowed so it continues even without my direct involvement. I want to make sure Caroline has the resources she needs for her practice, and that Thomas knows how much we value everything he has contributed. Samuel understood what she was really saying. They were not old yet, not by any reasonable standard, but they were at an age where thinking about legacy made sense. We will talk to a lawyer in Santa Fe, get everything written down properly. But Willa, you realize what we have built here is not just land and cattle. What we have built is a family that knows how to love and support each other, that understands the value of hard work and education and kindness. That is the legacy that will outlast any property. When did you become such a philosopher? Willa teased. When I married a woman who taught me to see beyond the immediate and practical to the meaningful and lasting. They grew old together in the way the best couples do, their love deepening even as their bodies aged and slowed. Samuel's hair went completely gray, then white, and his hands developed the arthritis common to men who had spent decades doing hard physical labor. Willa's auburn hair faded to silver, and she needed glasses for reading, but her mind remained sharp and her passion for teaching never dimmed. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration that brought together more than 100 people from Abiquiu and the surrounding areas. Former students came to honor the teacher who had changed their lives. Ranch hands from over the years returned to pay respects to the man who had treated them fairly and taught them well. The small ranch house could not possibly hold everyone, so they set up tables in the yard and roasted whole pigs in pits dug specifically for the occasion. Father Miguel, now ancient himself, said a blessing over the gathering. 30 years ago, I married these two people with some doubt in my heart about whether a marriage begun so quickly could possibly last. I am grateful that they proved me wrong. Samuel and Willa Kincaid have shown us all what it means to build a life based on love, faith, and commitment. They have raised children, both born to them and chosen by them, who carry their values forward into the world. They have contributed to this community in ways both material and spiritual. We are all blessed by their presence among us. Samuel and Willa stood together, his arm around her waist, both overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect. When it came time for them to speak, Samuel deferred to Willa, knowing she was better with words. 30 years ago, Willa began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. I was left behind by a stagecoach in what I thought was the worst moment of my life. I was terrified, alone, and certain that I had failed in my attempt to build a meaningful life. Then a cowboy with kind eyes offered me shelter, and everything changed. Samuel saw me not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worthy of respect and help. In doing so, he saved my life, though not in the way I initially thought. He saved me from a future built on fear and necessity, and offered me instead a future built on love and possibility. She paused, looking at Samuel with eyes full of emotion. These 30 years have not always been easy. We have faced drought and storm, loss and hardship, all the challenges that come with building a life in this beautiful, difficult land. But we have faced them together, and that has made all the difference. Our children, our grandchildren, this community that has embraced us, all of it springs from a decision we made to be brave enough to reach for happiness when it appeared, even though we had only known each other for 3 days. Samuel squeezed her hand, and she smiled through tears before continuing. 3 days was enough because we paid attention. We saw each other clearly and honestly, without pretense or delusion. We chose each other knowing it would be hard work, and we have put in that work every single day since. That is what I hope our children and grandchildren take from our example. Love is not just a feeling. It is a choice you make every single morning to honor your commitment, to see the best in your partner even when times are difficult, to build something together that is greater than what either of you could build alone. The crowd erupted in applause, and the celebration continued long into the night. Samuel danced with Willa under the stars, moving slowly to music played by local musicians, feeling grateful for every moment that had led to this one. As they entered their 60s, Samuel gradually handed over more responsibility for the ranch to Daniel and Thomas, though he still insisted on riding out to check on the cattle when his health allowed. Willa officially retired from teaching at 63, though she continued to mentor young teachers and could often be found reading to her grandchildren or helping them with their studies. They spent more time together, these two people who had built a life from 3 days of getting to know each other. They took walks in the cool mornings, pointing out changes in the land and reminiscing about the early days when everything had been new and uncertain. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played. Samuel died at 71, peacefully in his sleep after a day spent doing what he loved, riding through the ranch lands with Daniel and marveling at everything they had built. Willa found him the next morning, still and cold, his face peaceful in a way it rarely was in life. She did not cry at first, too shocked by the sudden absence of the man who had been her partner for 43 years. The funeral drew hundreds of people, a testament to the lives Samuel and Willa had touched. Father Miguel was gone, but his successor spoke beautifully about a man who had shown through his actions what it meant to be good and decent and kind. Samuel was buried in the small cemetery outside Abiquiu, with a view of the mountains he had loved and the lands he had worked. Willa survived him by 7 years, spending that time surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone. She continued to read voraciously, to write letters to her far-flung family members, to offer wisdom and perspective to anyone who asked for it. But everyone could see that part of her had gone with Samuel, the part that had come alive that first moment when he offered her shelter and safety. On a cool morning in October, at the age of 78, Willa passed away sitting in her chair on the porch, a book of poetry open in her lap. It was the same book her father had loved, the one she had read from that third night when Samuel asked her to share something meaningful. Inside the front cover, in Samuel's careful handwriting, was an inscription he had added years ago. "For my wife, who taught me that 3 days can be enough when you pay attention. All my love always." Willa was buried beside Samuel, and at the funeral, Caroline spoke about her parents' love story. "They showed us that happiness sometimes comes from the most unexpected places," she said, her voice steady despite her grief. "That being left behind can actually be the beginning of finding your way forward. That a tender gaze from the right person can change the entire trajectory of your life. My parents built something beautiful together, and that beauty lives on in all of us who carry their legacy forward." The ranch continued under the management of Daniel and his children, thriving into the 20th century and beyond. The school Willa had founded eventually became part of the public education system, but a plaque in the main building honored her as the founder and first teacher. Her teaching methods influenced education throughout the region, emphasizing individual attention and practical skills alongside traditional academics. Years after both Samuel and Willa had passed, their great-grandchildren would sit on that same porch and listen to stories about the cowboy and the teacher who had fallen in love in 3 days and built a dynasty on that foundation. The story never got old, never lost its power to inspire and comfort. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to the best ones. That being left behind can mean being exactly where you need to be, and that a future glimpsed in someone's tender gaze can become a reality that exceeds every dream. The ranch house still stood, expanded and modernized, but fundamentally the same structure Samuel had built with his own hands. The porch remained, weathered by decades of sun and wind and rain, witness to countless sunsets and whispered conversations and declarations of love. And if you sat there quietly in the evening, when the light turned golden and the mountains cast long shadows across the land, you could almost see them still, Samuel and Willa, holding hands and watching the day end, grateful for every moment of the beautiful life they had built together from the ashes of abandoned plans and the courage of reaching for something better.